One day, one summer, Linda Cincetti was showing me the copy of the Reader's Digest that she had secretly taken from her house. She read me the story, I Am Jane's Breast. She showed me the drawings, medical and cross-section. She showed them to me in the same spirit as the time she showed me dirty words from the Webster's Dictionary in my parents' garage. She pointed out words like piss, which was listed as slang, and shit, which did not appear, and vamp, which of course meant the top part of a shoe, but also meant an unscrupulous woman who seduces or exploits men. I knew there was something forbidden about it. I just didn't really know what it was. Linda was 2 years older than I was and lived across the street. She was the one I wanted to spend all my time with. And Linda Cincetti was the wild girl of the neighborhood. Linda had a walleye, and to hear her tell it, it was because she had spinal meningitis when she was a baby, and she had to be put on ice because her fever was so high or she would have burned right up. She said she had to have 20 operations on her eyes, and every time the doctors would take her eyes right out of their sockets and put them on her chest. She said she could still see out of her eyes, even when they weren't in her head. One afternoon, when we sat in the cool shade of a front porch eating fudgicles, she told me there was this lady who, when she had her baby had these yellow eyes. And she asked the people, "What did you do to my baby's eyes?" And the people said, "He has his father's eyes." And then her baby was the devil's baby, and then the lady jumped out of the window and died. There was the summer that Linda had a planter's wart on the sole of her foot. She told me that to remove it, the doctor had to use a long, red, hot needle with a hook to dig and dig and dig to get at the root of the wart. She told me that if you didn't get the root, it would grow longer and longer until it would grow into your bone, and then you would get blood poisoning and die in the night because it would be too late. She said that you could tell that you had blood poisoning because a red line would grow up your arm, and it would grow into your heart, and your heart would blow up, and you would be dead. Linda would often check my arms just to make certain that I did not have blood poisoning. That summer, Carly Simon wrote a song about cloudy coffee because she couldn't stop thinking about this one man. Linda hobbled about on her bandaged foot in the backyard, singing along with the transistor radio. I didn't know what vein meant, but I knew that it was on the same dictionary page as vagina and not too far away from vamp. Linda had a one-armed uncle named Carmen. She told me that he stuck his arm out of the car window and a truck came along and ripped it off at the socket. She told me that he had to stop the car and run down the road to pick it up. She said he almost bled to death. She told me another time that he was in the war and he got run over by a tank and it ripped the arm right out of the socket. She told me he had to run across the battlefield to pick it up. She said he almost bled to death. She told me that he was in a factory and got caught in a machine. She told me there was this bear. She told me that one day he saw this red line moving up his arm. Linda was the first one to tell me that Patty Gilliam was dead and that she'd been killed by the horse named Moose. The Gilliams lived on a small farm at the end of our street. They had a barn with several horses, 2 or 3 cows, some chickens, and a goat. I hated that goat. It had those yellow eyes. My sister is here in the front row. She knows these stories and she's dying. I hated that goat. It had those yellow eyes. The Gilliams would often often ride their horses down our street from their farm to the open fields just beyond the railroad tracks to graze beneath the humming electrical pylons that deliver electricity generated in Niagara Falls all the way to New York City. Mr. Gilliam always rode Moose, an aptly named, massively tall and broad-backed chestnut. Patty rode a little spotted gray mare named Mandy. The Gilliam farm was across the street from my school, and on my walks home, I would often stop to feed Moose and Mandy and Mrs. Gilliam's horse, who in my universe was a horse with no name. When Moose lumbered up to the fence, my heart would race. The other horses would shy away as Moose wagged his huge head and stomped his enormous hooves. He would feed greedily from my hand, his great white teeth rumbling in his head as he chewed. I loved to look into his deep brown eyes. There is something so weirdly thrilling about a horse's eyes. So much is reflected back, it's like falling into a hole. Linda said that the night that Patty was killed, she had had a terrible fight with her mother. She stormed out of the kitchen and ran to the barn and saddled up Moose, something she was forbidden to do. Being the wild girl of the neighborhood, Linda knew a great deal about mother-daughter animosity. Threats, demands, and accusations would fly between Linda and her mother as Mrs. Cicchetti slaved over boiling pots of spaghetti sauce, or Linda ran down the bubbling hot tar driveway. Linda said that Mrs. Gilliam was too late to stop Patty and only could watch helplessly as Patty rode around and around and around the pasture at full gallop and could do nothing but scream when Moose stepped into a rat hole and slipped and fell, and Patty went down with him, and she did not know how to roll away fast enough, and Moose rolled on top of her and crushed her dead, flat as a pancake. Sometime after Patty had been killed, on a night when Mrs. Cicchetti and my mother smoked cigarettes on the front porch, I laid in the yard looking for constellations. The sky suddenly glowed bright and orange. Showers of sparks floated above the tree line. We heard the sirens from the volunteer fire department go off, and everyone wondered aloud what could be burning. The light in the sky grew brighter, more yellow, and Mrs. Hasty, whose son and husband were volunteer firemen, came down the street to tell us what was happening. The Gilliams' barn was burning down, and all the animals were trapped inside. Mrs. Hasty told this story with some amount of excitement regarding her concern. She was the town crier, and therefore the most important person in the room, outside. The next day, Linda and I went to survey the damage. Where the barn once stood, there was only a large, black, still smoldering rectangle. In the pasture, a few small horses grazed under the sun. Obviously, some of the animals had escaped the fire. Moose wasn't anywhere in the pasture, and I didn't see that goat anywhere. Days later, Linda told me that Mrs. Gilliam had deliberately set the barn on fire. She had wanted to get rid of Moose. Linda said she locked Moose in his stall, poured kerosene, and lit a match. As the hay burst into flame and caught the old timbers, the animals panicked. And as the barn burned down around him, Moose kicked and kicked and kicked at the wall of the barn and broke through the planks. Some of the smaller horses escaped just as the roof of the barn collapsed, but it was too late for Moose. Linda told me that Mrs. Gilliam went crazy after the fire and had to go live in the attic. That fall, the remaining horses were sold and the Gilliams moved away. And every so often, as we climbed trees or built forts or dug up rocks or overturned logs in the woods near the Gilliam farm, Linda would tell me that Moose had indeed escaped the fire. It was still living somewhere among the trees. She said that he was mostly burned and that you could see his bones and organs through the holes burned into his hide. She said maybe it was his ghost. And listen. Listen. Do you hear him? Can you hear him, Winnie? La 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 la. My hackles would raise and I would run away home. She was the wild girl of the neighborhood. And Linda Cincetti was the best storyteller in town.
So bye bye, Miss American Pie. Don't wish everything I love you, but the love you.